The front lines in Kursk are collapsing much faster than expected. And we also see that the narrative for the invasion of Kursk is also collapsing. That is, that the media now is in a rush to create a new story, given that Kursk was being sold to the public as a success story, how Ukraine could win the war. Yet it was this focus, this excessive focus on narratives, which were elevated above reality, which led us to this disaster to begin with. So it's worth exploring how can we explain the decision of Ukraine and NATO to some extent to invade Kursk to begin with, and how did it go so wrong? Because many of us warned from the first day that this invasion would end terribly. However, this assessment was to a large extent based on the tangible benefits from invading, how it would change the actual battlefield. However, to a large extent, the invasion of Kursk was intended and supported to change the narrative and to function as a form of psychological warfare. But this also went terribly wrong. Now, we can argue that there's many tangible objectives for invading Kursk. Indeed, the most likely objectives, first and foremost, was to seize the Kursk nuclear power plant. It also seems likely that the key purpose was to create a buffer zone, to divert Russian troops away from other front lines, to disrupt Russian logistics and supply chains, and also give Ukraine a strong bargaining chip in future negotiations. However, there's another objective of this, which has been stated very clearly from the different sponsors of the invasion of Kursk, which is that a war of narratives, the need to control what people think about the war. If you think that the Ukrainians can win the war, then it's more likely that they will fight harder. It's more likely that the Western public will supply more weapons. In other words, this is a key purpose of narrative control and propaganda. You effectively fake it till you make it. In September of 2024, we saw something quite remarkable. That is that the intelligence chiefs of both the US and the UK met and gave more or less a press conference, something we usually do not see. What was also remarkable is that MI6 chief Richard Moore, as well as the CIA chief William Burns, they both referenced that the benefit, or one of the benefits or strength or objectives of the invasion of Kursk was to change the narrative. The MI6 chief Richard Moore argued that, quote, "I think it's typically audacious and bold on the part of the Ukrainians to try to change the game in this way. I think they have, to a degree, changed the narrative around this." And from the CIA, we see that the CIA director William Burns concurred. He argued, quote, "I think what these events have done, the Kursk offensive most recently, is to put a dent in that narrative," referring then to the narrative of Russian victories. Now, the Germans were even more specific in terms of what was aimed to be achieved, or at least aspired to be achieved by invading Kursk. The German Bundeswehr Major General Christian Freuding, he suggested that a key objective was to increase the morale of Ukrainians, to demoralize the Russians, and to convince the Western public that the war could be won in order to then gain more support for funding. Again, all of this is important. If the Ukrainians think they can win, they would continue fighting more. If the Russians think they were losing, they would not be willing to fight. And of course, keeping the war enthusiasm among the Western public high, so no one questions that this is a just war, that there's no alternatives than winning on the battlefield. And of course, that all the weapons being sent will result eventually in victory. And this is where the narrative was organized. Now, the German Major General Freuding, he also noted that foreign troops were back on Russian soil for the first time since the invasion by Nazi Germany in the Second World War. And this, he believed, would have a very devastating psychological effect on the Russians.
Es war auch ein Rational, die russische Propaganda der Spezialoperation Lügen zu strafen. Zum ersten Mal seit weit über einem halben Jahrhundert stehen wieder fremde Truppen auf russischem Boden. Und natürlich sollte das auch einen psychologischen Effekt haben. Nach innen für die Ukraine als Bestärkung für die ukrainischen Streitkräfte, als Bestärkung für die ukrainische Gesellschaft und auch nach außen gegenüber den Unterstützerstaaten als Signal, ja, wir können was, wir schaffen das, wir setzen auf eure weitere Unterstützung auf dem Weg zum Erfolg.
We also see that the retired German general Klaus Wittmann also argued that Kursk played an important role when Nazi Germany invaded during the Second World War. And this is now, as he points out, also where the Russian leadership are humiliated. And General Wittmann criticized these Western restrictions on weapons that were supplied for the invasion of Kursk, and that the West's fear of escalation must stop.
Lächerlich. Im Übrigen, als Historiker ist mir auch bewusst, welche Rolle Kursk gerade im großen Vaterländischen Krieg gespielt hat. Und ausgerechnet dort findet diese Demütigung der russischen Führung statt. Das ist schon enorm. Und was Sie sagten über die westlichen Genehmigungen oder Beschränkungen, da kann ich nur ganz deutlich wiederholen. Die Beschränkungen, die wir der Ukraine auferlegen für die Nutzung westlicherseits gelieferter Waffen, die finde ich absurd und die helfen Putin. Und wenn der Bundeskanzler die funktionieren, dann kann ich nur sagen, die funktionieren nur für Russland. Und diese Eskalationsangst und die Rücksichtnahme.
And all of this, of course, said by these German generals while German tanks were yet again rolling into Russia. But it did not work as planned. That is, I think the West bought into their own propaganda that this war was about Putin's ambitions. And this was deeply problematic because the assumption was that Putin would be humiliated and opposition would be building in Russia against him among the elites. So, and this again could then result in a possible regime change, which has been stated by many Western leaders early on as being a key objective in this war. Instead, we saw something very different. What happened in Kursk, for many Russians, it transitioned to become a war of liberation. So we saw that the historical memory of Kursk, instead of demoralizing the Russians, it augmented the solidarity and the preparedness to fight. And furthermore, the invasion of Kursk also was seen to have been supported by NATO countries, which indeed provides the weapons, trainings, intelligence, war planning, even target selections.
Can any serious argument be made that Ukraine invaded Russia on its own, that the U.S. did not know about it, approve it, and orchestrate it? The same with Great Britain and the same with the rest of NATO?
Of course not. Everything that Ukraine does is not only known, but it's aided and abetted by the United States, by the UK, by Poland. That's what NATO is. This is a NATO war. So of course not. It's not even an issue.
Where is it going to get them? Wasn't this a foolish charade to win a propaganda war?
For many Russians, Putin's warnings about a NATO-backed attack on Russia with Ukraine as a proxy was seen to be proven to be correct. So, in other words, instead of dividing Russia and weakening the Kremlin, we saw the opposite. Furthermore, the Second World War memory that the German leadership thought it was a good idea to invoke for psychological warfare also backfired. And we saw on the ground that one of the NATO-backed Ukrainian battalions that participated in the invasion of Kursk, it was the Nachtigall Battalion, which was named after Nazi Germany's Nachtigall Battalion. And again, the Kremlin narrative that NATO-backed fascists had taken over Ukraine, built up its extremists from 2014 to be used against the Russians, was also seen to be validated by many Russians. So over the next month, we saw Russian TV screens providing all the imagery which needed to create a very strong case for the war. That is, you had the imagery of Ukrainian soldiers, many of them wearing fascist symbols, kidnapping civilians, committing war crimes, and this was followed by very supportive statements from Western military leaders and the media. Now, one can imagine how this would play in Russia, and obviously, it did not provide this demoralizing effect as it had initially intended. So, eventually, reality catches up, and the reality is that Kursk was a very costly military operation, as Ukraine took huge casualties and lost much military equipment. Now, Ukrainian troops had to leave their fortified positions, primarily in Donbass, and were then sent to Kursk, where they were put in the open. Their supply lines were weak, they were exposed, and the deeper they went into Russia, the weaker they became. And this is something we saw in the final stages as well, in which every major road had been covered by Russian FPV drones. Furthermore, there was a lack of engineering equipment that could be brought into Russia to prepare and strengthen the positions of the Ukrainians. Now, furthermore, the troops used in the Kursk operation were drawn from Ukraine's well-fortified positions in Donbass, which therefore also led to a collapse along the strategic front line, primarily around the Pokrovsk region. And all of this, of course, is very bad strategy, because sacrificing men and equipment in a PR stunt is especially dangerous in a war of attrition, as in a war of attrition, the objective is to exhaust the enemy. In a war where there's no political or diplomatic pathways, in other words, a war to the last soldiers, military resources should be focused and concentrated in areas where the attrition rates are favorable, where one's own troops take low casualties, but they're able to inflict high casualty on the opponents. So accepting high casualties to conquer non-strategic territory that cannot really be held was always seemed to be a very foolish strategy. Now, that doesn't mean that we should dismiss the objective of narrative control and propaganda altogether, because these are important parts of war. And even PR battles are important to the extent they result in, for example, higher military recruitment in Ukraine, or more willingness within NATO countries to keep on sending more money and sending more weapons. But we saw that the Western political media establishment continuously misinformed about the attrition rates. That is, that the Ukrainians were taking few losses, while the Russians, apparently fighting with shovels, taking huge losses. Now, but still, the attrition rates do not sell as well as territorial changes. So Zelensky had to deliver something, that is to change the borders to Ukraine's favor, or even conquering Russian territory. This was seen as something that would really change the narrative. And as we see among the Western media, the excitement and commitment to funding the war increases when you see territorial victories by Ukraine. And it makes sense. The promise of victory seems more probable. And we also saw that the Western public could often lose interest in the Ukraine war without any territorial advancement, which was especially a problem when Project Ukraine had to compete with Gaza for media attention. So we are seeing the end of the Kursk occupation. Russia's approach to the invasion of Kursk initially was, or should have been, predictable. Initially, they aimed to stabilize the front lines and then to use these new front lines to inflict high losses on the Ukrainian army. So a lot of the expectations that Russia would simply pull out its troops from everywhere and desperately send them to Kursk proved not to be correct. And again, we saw instead that the narrative victory of Ukraine in Kursk became a narrative trap, as Zelensky could not pull out of Kursk, even when the high losses became unsustainable. Indeed, this was a sign of victory for Ukraine. This is what kept the hope that they could actually win this war, which was the premise for why a lot of soldiers would sign up for fighting at the front line, and also why the Western public were willing to keep sending money. Indeed, if there's no possibility to end this war or for Ukraine to win the war, then pushing for a long war to bleed the Russian troops using Ukrainians would just seem cruel. So the prospect of victory was important, and Kursk provided this. Now, also with the possible, after bleeding the Ukrainian army, we saw that now that the negotiations appear to be coming, possibly coming at least, Russia is now closing the pockets of Kursk and restoring control over its territory. Now, a critical moment occurred recently, that is, after months of slowly chipping away at the Ukrainian armed forces in Kursk. We saw that the position was further weakened as some Ukrainian troops had to be relocated to the Donbas front. And then, of course, we saw an incredible mission by Russian forces. And the context there is important because recently Ukraine cut gas transit from Russia to Europe. Now, the Russians came up with a plan which they could use, taking advantage of this. That is that the Russians, they emptied the pipeline of gas, filled it with oxygen, and they sent soldiers through these pipelines. So suddenly we saw vast amounts of Russian soldiers emerging behind Ukrainian frontline. And this was combined in what seems to be a very well planned attack. It was combined with attacks from multiple directions. And the Ukrainian army, which had already been exhausted, weakened, and with poor communication and key roads already under Russian drone control, effectively began to collapse. And we saw a disorganized withdrawal, which enabled the Russians to attack the withdrawing troops, which inflicting even more casualties on the Ukrainians. We saw many Ukrainian soldiers surrendered, and of course, huge amounts of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers being surrounded with no possibility of escaping. So this is a real disaster, and it sparks a crisis on many levels. First of all, the collapse of Kursk suggests that now a new, very unfavorable front would be opening up on the Ukrainian side of that border. Also, given that this was to a large extent a war or an invasion intended to change the narrative, we see now that the narrative has fallen apart. And but again, it's worth noting that this war or this invasion never made any sense. Keep in mind, in a war of attrition, Ukraine was already in a very weak position. That is, that it had a shortage of manpower, its front lines were being thinned out, which allowed the Russians to start to make advances. So this is where Ukraine was at a crossroad. On one hand, given its weakened position, it would make more sense to withdraw to more reliable front lines. However, at the same time, it was imperative to control the narrative. So instead, at this point of time in a war of attrition, when the Ukrainian army is weakened, instead of pulling back, we saw instead that they extended the front line. And again, this is why the Kursk offensive or invasion took many by surprise, because before that, the Russians had opened a front line in Kharkov simply because the Ukrainian front lines were thinned out. So what made sense to do then is to open another front line in Kharkov in order to further stretch out the Ukrainian forces. Now, that the Ukrainian responded by opening up yet another front line in Kursk made simply no sense at all from a strategic point of view, but in a war of narratives, it could of course be defended. And even now, as we see Kursk collapsing, we see the Ukrainian army engaging in very costly counterattacks, attacking Russian front lines and inflicting heavy losses on the Ukrainian army. Again, this has a purpose for serving the narrative. It's important to seem strong for its partners at a time when especially the United States appears to be walking away from Ukraine with the belief that this war can't be won. But it's also important to show strength ahead of negotiations. So from this perspective, improve the narrative, show that they can, well, change the tide by taking territories from the Russians. However, this yet again now comes at the expense of the situation in the real world. That is, whatever Ukraine takes now in Donetsk or Lugansk, they're not going to be able to hold, and it's going to result in being in an even weaker position. So again, good for narrative, bad for reality. So where are we now? Well, new narratives have to be constructed to explain the loss of Kursk without, of course, losing the public support for continued war. So we can already see the predictable path they're going. The loss will be likely blamed on Trump for cutting funding to the Ukrainian army and intelligence, or insufficient military support from the Western countries altogether. Now, such narratives will likely prevail in the media, given that the public has not received any information over the past few months what has actually transpired in Kursk, how the Ukrainian army was gradually weakened. So, most sensible analysts must have known that the invasion of Kursk would likely end in such a catastrophe. Yet, the analysis on how to achieve victory are usually restrained by war propaganda, which shows that the narrative also has a negative impact here in the West, that it becomes, we become captured by our own narratives and our own propaganda. So, for example, it's more or less obligatory in the West to, quote, stand by Ukraine. However, we never have any critical analysis of what it means to stand with Ukraine. Instead, it's assumed that it can only mean to celebrate and support any policies or decisions made by Zelensky. Indeed, if you criticize Zelensky, then you undermine the government, and this is seen to be anti-Ukrainian. However, as Zelensky's former advisor, Alexei Arestovich, argued, he pointed out that, for example, treating Ukraine's Russian speakers as second-rate citizens, that this weakened the ability of Ukraine to fight, because a huge part of the Ukrainian population had lost a lot of their motivation. What exactly were they fighting for? Now, you can also say that the purging of the political opposition, the cultural purge, the purge of the media, and the purge of the Orthodox Church also contributed to alienate large parts of the population. So this was a poor decision. However, one cannot criticize this in the West. It would be considered heresy to criticize what Zelensky is doing. After all, if you criticize what's being done to the Ukrainians, then you could be accused of being anti-Ukrainian because you undermine the authority of the state. So, and this also applies to the disaster in Kursk. It had to be met with everyone, every analyst in the West had to applaud this as being a success story. Again, Zelensky is Ukraine as far as the political media establishment is concerned. So even though we walked down this predictable path to defeat, everyone had to celebrate it as we went along, as if this would be a victory.